Expandly is a SaaS platform that supports international sellers bring their brands into the UK and Europe.
So for a seller that's looking to expand into a new region, how does Expandly make that simpler for sellers?
The way Expandly make it easy is we break it down into country.
What do you think's the one part of the expansion process that's most kind of overlooked?
Overlooked, I think.
Compliance, does that relate to the ingredients of a product, labelling of a product, or is it kind of all of the above?
All of the above.
If you were to have your own brand, what are the kind of products that you would avoid selling? Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Seller's Journey podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by my old mate Drew from Expandly, head of sales from Expandly. Welcome along,
Really
Drew.
call me that? I don't know. Debatable. Hi, Drew Cooper, head of sales at Expandly. We're going to talk a little bit about what Expandly do, but lead a team of awesome BDMs supporting people grow their businesses into Europe. So great to see you again, Amp. Thank you.
Cheers for coming along. Can you just give me a quick overview of what Expandly is and how it helps e-commerce sellers?
Yeah, so Expandly is a SaaS platform that supports international sellers bring their brands into the UK and Europe. And the way that we support that is through multiple services. So in order to trade compliantly, you need to touch on several things. And the first being product and label compliance, to make sure that your products firstly can be sold, but secondly, labelled appropriately, they've got like symbols on them, you've got the appropriate paperwork and documentation with it in order to trade in line with the legislation or regulations of that particular country. Second piece is VAT. So for those international sellers may liken it to tax rather than VAT, but this is the business compliance. So this is to ensure that your business can trade compliantly, that you're VAT registered and you've got a VAT number attached to that. That goes without saying, and that your business is going to file for VAT in line with that particular country's regulations. Attached to that VAT number will come something called an EORI number, which is the shipping element of a VAT, so in order for you to clear customs into that region. So we support with the registration and ongoing compliance of that. Then there comes the translational piece, so to ensure that your product labels and your listings are translated appropriately. So we have that inbuilt into Expandly, so you can go on and translate your listings in there appropriately, get them optimized and ready for sale. There's some other complexities surrounding Europe as well, such as EPR, so Extended Producer Responsibility. This is a European regulation that supports the end-of-life contribution from the seller of the product to the destruction of those goods or when they're thrown away at the end of their life. I'll take a breath through that. So we cover so much here. Expandly is a great tool to help that. So we also have warehouses. So we've got warehouses in the UK, EU, and more recently the USA. So all of that into Expandly and then completed by a listings management tool. So a tool that supports people go multi-marketplace, omni-channel through Expandly's software.
So all of that sounds quite complicated. So for a seller that's looking to expand into a new region, those steps that you've just spoken through sound like a barrier in their own right.
Yeah,
because
right.
I mean, that's a lot of work and it sounds really complex. Mm-hmm. So how does Expandly make that simpler for sellers?
Yeah, good question. So whilst it does sound complex, actually it's not too arduous. Like it sounds like as soon as you mention compliance, people just think, oh God, I've got to deal with that, and it's going to be really painful, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know what region I'm going in, I don't know the country specifics. But the way Expandly make it easy is we break it down into country, so people can opt for different countries. And although things like the European regulations are they're broad, but they're the same for every country really, typically. They do have their own nuances depending on what country, but generally they're the same. We make it easy by providing one document or one piece of information to the client that covers all of those pieces together. So they haven't got to break it down and worry about going into France first and Germany, then Spain, and having to really navigate each individual nuances of those countries. We make it really simple to make your packaging compliant for Europe in its entirety.
Got it.
Attached, of course, with the UK. So that it provides that as a sort of a one-stop shop for that piece. And similarly with VAT, when we're asking for these document uploads, which typically can be one of the barriers to people doing it is the amount of documentation they've got to upload for the local government. We compile all of this information and use it for different services where required. So instead of, if you're dealing with multiple service providers, you'd have to provide all of that information to service provider A, then provide all that information to service provider B. What Expandly does, it collates it and then pushes it out to each individual service. So you don't have to upload it multiple times, nor do they have to deal with multiple people. So it's a really good consolidation tool, enables you to trade somewhere that's unfamiliar for you with just uploading your documentation and your information and your product labels once.
Wow, yeah, that's really cool. And then in terms of physically selling in another country, how does your kind of warehousing infrastructure support that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we've got warehouses in the UK, in the Netherlands, just outside of Hoofddorp, and then more recently in the US. So the way that adds benefit to a seller who's trading in those regions is they've got one warehouse management software. So just use Expandly to hold their listing information, the details of their SKUs, all of their ASIN information and their barcodes, and then that gets distributed across all of the 3 locations, along with inventory levels, which subsequently, because of the listings management part of Expandly, can hold that and push it out to different marketplaces as well, which is really important. And it can distribute and let the client know the inventory levels in each individual location, and if they want to do stock transfers, which may or may not be appropriate for that brand, but do stock transfers, we're going to be able to complete that with ease. And then also have that, just again, that centralized portal for holding information, adjusting information, pushing orders, and that through makes it really straightforward for them.
Wow, yeah, sounds really cool. In your experience supporting sellers to expand into multiple different regions, what do you think's the one part of the expansion process that's most kind of overlooked?
Overlooked, I think, probably just be the EPR regulation, and because it's quite new, not all countries require it. So just for clarity, again, it's called extended producer responsibility, and this is a regulation in some countries that require the client to contribute towards the end of life of that product, essentially, and the packaging. And there's different variables in each country, which I won't go into those for this. But yeah, they contribute at the beginning of their journey in that country to the amount of waste that they're producing. Now, that one is often overlooked because it's not everywhere. People are wondering whether it's even appropriate to them. So some people don't do it. Some people have to do it because the marketplace pushes them to do it, which is of course help. But some marketplaces don't, or if they're selling on their own website, they might not be in tune with it. But in terms of complexities of trade, people, as soon as you mention compliance, people think it's difficult, and they think it's going to cause them problems. Or they may even think that their products can't be sold full stop and they haven't got the right packaging or certifications in order to trade. So that's the biggest blocker, or certainly the biggest discussed blocker that we experience people talking about. I don't want to go there because of the compliance requirements. And that's something which is really, it's a necessity in order to trade, a relative of your product category. However, some product categories are higher risk than others. So it means that those, they need to be registered, for instance, in some cases. So it's really important that you get that checked out, whether your products can be sold, how they can be sold, what you need to do in order to sell them, and then subsequently what markings, certification you need in order to trade.
Okay, so can we break this down a little bit to make it really kind of clear and simple? Compliance, does that relate to the ingredients of a product? Does it relate to the labeling of a product, or is it kind of all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above. So there's, I suppose we could break it down into several pockets. The first being whether it can be sold or not. So the European regulations are somewhat tighter than a lot of other countries. We'll use the USA as an example for the purposes of this. So against USA regulations, European regulations are far tighter, which means that you have to have certain terminology, certain use of claims, certain the ways it's laid out in terms of metrics. The European regulations state that you need to have certain things translated in some countries more than others, and you need to have your ingredients laid out in a certain way. So there's lots of different variables to that. So how the product packaging is presented to the consumer upon purchase. Yes, that's the first thing. The second thing is certain ingredients. So there's a lot of banned ingredients where they can be sold in other countries. The European Union, and I'll keep the UK involved in that as well, do lots of testing to understand if products are safe, whereas in some other countries they don't necessarily go to those lengths to do that, which means that we have something called a novel foods list, which is where ingredients sit on that can't be sold, used in products at all. And until they're tested and deemed safe, you just can't trade with them. So things like that need to be checked out. Then there's the marking. So for instance, electronic devices require a CE mark, and that CE mark is backed up by a document called a Declaration of Conformity. Now, a Declaration of Conformity is a European document. So that won't exist if you're a US seller. You just would never have heard of that because it's not a document that's required in order to trade electronic products in America. So gaining some knowledge on whether your product fits in that electronic category. I mean, in most cases, it's going to be obvious, but whether it fits in that category and then what's required in order for you to bear the CE mark. And that's going to be backed up by some documentation. So there is lots of variables to it. And then the fourth piece of this really is if you've got products in what is deemed as a higher risk category, and to name a few, that's food supplements, cosmetics, medical devices and medicines, if they fit in those categories, then in most cases, you're going to have to register them. So you're going to need to have some fiscal representation in the region in order to support you with that. So unless you've got an entity in where you plan to sell, for instance, you want to go in the UK and you've got a cosmetic product, you need somebody with a UK registered business who's competent and confident about understanding that product and support you with the product information file, which is the documentation you need in order to trade to register that product for you. So that comes by the way of a responsible person, which is something else. So yeah, I think you can break it down to certain areas. Now, it sounds, as I mentioned earlier, really complex. However, just getting the right advice on it will eradicate all of that problematic piece that most people will assume.
Yeah, I can see why it would potentially put people off. Mm-hmm. But I guess, when you break it down, it's probably not as, complex as it first seems. If you were to have your own brand, mm-hmm. what are the kind of products that you would avoid selling or avoid expanding into Europe?
There's only actually very few. The first one being any form of medicine, particularly if it hasn't been sold, it's not used already in the region. So do your research first. I mean, just talk hypothetically here, but if you're using paracetamol or something and you wanted to launch a paracetamol product in its same form as something that's sold, then okay, that may not be as complex as you trying to, launch something or get something compliant, such as a high dose of melatonin or something like that, which is it's not been able to be used in the form that you'd find it in most countries. So I'd stay clear of them, because if you want to have them tested yourself and you want them to, go through lab testing, it's going to be quite costly to start, let alone the registrations. Second one is Class 1 medical devices. So anything that sort of entering the skin and stuff like that can be quite tricky. This doesn't mean to say, I'll just be clear, it doesn't mean to say that these don't do well or can't be sold, but these are like the really ones which are quite complex. Finally, just dangerous goods. So, of course, in Europe, we have entirely different rules to most countries on, weapons and stuff like that. So anything that's down that route, probably not going to do particularly well. But yeah, just stay clear of anything which is deemed as a high-risk, dangerous good.
Okay. Are there any kind of crossovers with categorization across Europe? So what I mean by that is, could you have one product in the UK that's not deemed as a medical device, but perhaps in Germany, they would deem that product as a medical device?
That's a really interesting question. So I suppose there may be some times when that is the case, but 99.9% of it is not about whether it's deemed compliant or not in a country, it's how you're presenting that to a consumer. For instance, so your terminology on your product label, on your packaging, can often change that from being, a medicine or a medical device to a general product. Just something I can think of as an example, like, if you've got like a yoga roller, one of these yoga rollers with some balls in it that you use for, just to massage your back. If you were to state that, this removes back pain, as an example, a bit extreme, then you'd probably find that would be classed as a medical device, and therefore you've got entirely different set of regulations. Whereas if you sell it as a yoga roller, and that's it's a yoga roller, pretty evident it's going to do what it says on the tin, then it put it in a general product category. So it's more about how you're presenting it to a consumer. Now, if how you intend to deliver it to a consumer is your brand's USP, then of course you're going to need to go down that route of getting it tested. Or however, if you're putting it on there to just naturally increase sales, then you may just want to think about the best route forward and whether going down that route is the right way, or whether you change it to a general product.
So is there like Sol's muscle problem would be classed as like a medical claim,
Yeah.
Is there a way that you can change the wording slightly so that it's not so much of a claim?
Yeah, I mean, don't quote me on the particular terminology, but yeah, if you were to say solves muscle pain, I mean, that's quite a bold statement. You're going to need that backed up by some scientific evidence. If you say supports muscle recovery, potentially, depending on what it is. So nobody goes selling rollers and quote me on solving, muscle recovery. But if you to change it to that sort of terminology, then it's likely that to fall into a different category, yes.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So then from a compliance perspective, what kind of timelines are you looking at? So if I've got a product that fits into, let's say it's a set of headphones,
Yep.
and I'm selling them in the UK and I want to sell them in Germany, what is that kind of timeline of making sure that I've got all the right pieces in place to make sure that I'm compliant in Germany?
Yeah, so if you're in the UK selling into Europe, the likelihood is that you're already going to have compliant packaging for sale in Europe, apart from translations, of course. But yeah, you're likely to have some compliant packaging because you would have gone through your due diligence for the UK. And despite our split from the European Union, we share the same regulations in the main. So the likelihood is that you'll be compliant already. However, I would still get it checked. Now that product label review is what Expandy call it, can take up to 2 weeks, depending on the product category. But we will provide with a detailed report on what's compliant, what's not, if there's any changes, removals or additions of information, and then support you with getting your label compliant if it's not. If it's compliant, then your next stage then would be to instruct a responsible person, which is required for products in the UK and Europe. So you'd need one in both. So if you're UK business, you're likely to represent yourself because you're a UK registered business. And when you go to Europe, you're going to need somebody to support you with that. And that process takes up to a week. So start to finish with some tweaks, 2 to 4 weeks would be a fair estimation.
Okay. Is there ever a product category that you wouldn't get checked for compliance?
So general products in Europe up until December 2024, that's just to check my years then, fell underneath, they still fell into what's called a general product safety regulation, GPSR, but they fell underneath the requirement for you to have any fiscal representation, so responsible person. So technically, as long as you followed the regulation or didn't, but then didn't get checked by anybody else, by the regulators, then you'd be okay. However, from December 2024, they now require in Europe a responsible person, so you'd need to have them checked. It's not the same for the UK yet. So we will follow the European Union. However, it's not a requirement. So technically, if you wanted to sell what would be deemed as a general product, provided you're confident it's a general product, then you can sell that in the UK with very little information on your label, very basic information.
Got it. If you wanted to sell that into Europe,
You'd need to get it checked.
you'd need to get it checked.
Indeed.
What is the process? What are you looking for when you're checking a product's compliance?
So we're checking for multiple things. So we're checking for the layout of information, the claims, how the information is presented to the consumer and is it appropriate for the product category. If it has ingredients, we'll be checking ingredients, directions of use, any instruction manuals to make sure that's okay, and then any markings on there. So dependent on what product category, it may or may not require some recycling logos as an example, the CE mark we spoke about earlier. There may be other bits that's required on your label in order to remain compliant. So in its entirety, everything about it really. Okay. We're not looking for the aesthetics. The aesthetics of how you present it, that's entirely up to the seller.
And what is the kind of detriment to not having a product checked before you sell? Can you do that?
I mean, technically you can, because if you think the amount of products being sold in the UK, I mean, it's just millions, hundreds of millions of products. Now, the regulators and the legal teams behind it are only so big. So it's really a case of some stuff you will have to, because you're going to be at much higher risk of selling it. Use cosmetics as an example. It needs to be registered on the SCPM portal. So in order for you to trade compliantly, you need to have it registered. If you don't have it registered and then somebody picks it up and says, oh, I'm just going to check if this is registered and it's not, then there's a lot of complications to that. So higher risk products, I would suggest that if you're that way inclined and you're intending on selling stuff without having it checked and having an appropriate responsible person, I would steer clear of it in those categories for sure, for certain. General product, as I mentioned, currently in the UK, there's no requirement for a responsible person. Therefore, there is no enforcement from marketplaces.
So with all that in mind, are there any kind of products or product categories that you wouldn't necessarily get checked for compliance?
Not really. if I'm honest. I mean, there's some product categories like the higher risk ones which are a must because they need registration in the main. So things like cosmetics, food supplements, you're going to need to have them registered on the appropriate portal by your responsible person or food business operator. You're going to need them to be registered. So therefore, if they're not, and somebody says, "Oh, I'm going to go and check this product to make sure it's compliant," and it's not registered, then the complications that come with that are not very pleasant. But general products, particularly for the UK, where whilst they're under the general product regulation, they don't require any responsible person, nor do they require any registration. There are probably millions of products that are deemed non-compliant. Now, the policing of that, so from the regulator or the governing body, it's quite difficult to regulate that volume. So therefore, typically what happens is they put the responsibility on the marketplace, which is what's happened in Europe for the GPSR regulation. So the marketplace are policing it. So they'll have people checking it. They'll be checking it on the inbound. They'll be checking it on the outbound to consumer to make sure that it's got all the necessary markings on. However, there's lots of those products still non-compliant. And of course, until you're checked, then technically you can continue to trade. However, of course, I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah, I mean, you could go under the radar for whether it be a day or 5 years, who knows? But yeah, I mean, I would recommend getting everything checked. Okay. And if you're serious about trade and it's not a short-term thing, which why would it be? Then go for your due diligence.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it before. Obviously, working within account management for quite a while, Amazon tend to take action first and ask questions later.
Yep.
So if they decided they don't think your product's compliant, they shut your product down straight away. We know that they do that.
Yep.
If your product is compliant, how easy is it to provide Amazon that documentation really quickly so that they can then relist your product?
Yeah, so in the case of Europe now, you need to enter that information in order to have your listing created or set up. So, or if you've already got it created, they request it and then you get a certain amount of time to upload it. So whilst you're absolutely right, they tend to just shut your listing and then require documentation, they've given an opportunity for people to upload that if they haven't already. So, which is obviously removing the likelihood of that happening, because you have to upload it from day one, or you get an allotted time in order to do so. However, of course, regulations change, laws come into play. So therefore, when the marketplace now, because they're responsible for it, when they hear about it, they'll give an appropriate deadline in order for you to go and get that. In the case of general products, though, it's unlikely anything significant is going to change.
Okay, that's really interesting stuff. And then in terms of a brand that is sat looking at their products thinking, these would do really well in Germany, I just really can't be bothered to go through the whole compliance piece. What would your advice be to them?
Do it. If you've got any plan to get significant growth in Germany, which as we know is the biggest marketplace in Europe, then go through it early doors. It's going to take you a couple of weeks. Unless you've got a huge SKU count, individual SKU count, not variants of the same SKU, individual SKUs, then it's relatively cost effective. So go through it now. And as I mentioned, the likelihood is you're going to have most of the documentation anyway. The likelihood is you're going to not need to change anything significant on your packaging. And the likelihood is you're going to come out of it thinking, actually, that wasn't too bad. So do it. Don't risk it. And certainly don't risk the opportunity of your listings being taken down. I mean, it's far more detrimental to your business to do that than take a short-term period of time to get it checked.
Interesting. Okay, that's really cool. And then final question from me. How do you recommend that brands kind of assess the kind of opportunity in a different region before they kind of start to go through this sort of process?
Yeah, marketplaces have got lots of great tools that can assist you with doing that. Whether you're, whether you're a managed seller or not. I mean, in the case of Amazon, there's still lots of tools available to assess the feasibility and the likelihood of your product doing well. However, Expandly can support with that. So if you would like us to support with a feasibility study, due to our relationship in this podcast, we can do them for free to assess the feasibility of a product in region. And it will give you a detailed information on whether your product's likely to do well, who your competitors are, and then what your likelihood of, trajectory over the next 1 to 3 years is going to be. So do that first. If there's significant opportunity, then go for it. Go for the compliance piece, become VAT registered, do everything appropriately, and you'll reap the benefits.
Amazing. Thank you, Drew. As always, we've got a school community that's totally free for Amazon sellers. We'll put the information in there so that you can go and get this feasibility study that Drew mentioned just a second ago. But there'll be a sign-up link in the description, so please go down, sign up. It's a free community. There'll be tons of tools in there for you to kind of look at, and information and classrooms for you to go and learn different things about Amazon and e-commerce as a whole. But that was really interesting. Thanks, Drew. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak to me.
Likewise.
And look forward to speaking again soon.
Good. Thanks, everyone.